I have a couple of questions for the audience. First, who loves food? Raise your hand. Any food? Fantastic. Who had lunch today? Okay, that's a good sign. Who knew exactly where your food came from? Which farm, what trucks it took to get here to Zug? One person, you know. That is what we're here to discuss today. Supply chains. Where do our products come from? How do we know that they get there? And how can we have more transparency about where the food we consume, the pharmaceuticals we take, the products we buy come from around the world? I'm super excited to have our panel here today because we have a huge spectrum on here. Gil is from an illustrious European conglomerate from SAP with almost 92,000 employees, more than 100 years of corporate history. Gert here from Tradeshift, almost 10 years of history, but has built out a huge operation and specifically has moved into the blockchain space over the last few years. And finally, we have sort of the startup perspective with Hope, with Eximchain, who is sort of entering into the supply chain world. So, all of you come from different perspectives, but we're halfway through 2018, and supply chain has definitely been an application that has been talked from the beginning of sort of the blockchain world. Where are we today? What's sort of the state of the art from each of your perspectives? Why don't we start with Gil?
I think that overall we're at the stage of moving from large phase pilots to beginning to see implementation. So I think the last couple of years there was the move. Obviously, we started with crypto, moved into blockchain, and the challenge with blockchain implementation in the enterprise is that it's not only the application or the use case, but you actually need to build an ecosystem, a network, a business network around it. And that has been challenging because in many of those networks you actually have competitors that need to agree on a common language and how to collaborate. So bringing those together is challenging, to say the least, and it needs to be done in an industry per industry. So if you think of pharma, it's one. Transportation could be another, and we can go on. And I think what's really driving a lot of this is, at the end of the day, the regulation. So there's a lot of regulation that is not specifically asked for blockchain, but blockchain is a way to address that, and putting all those things together actually is driving. So I would say we're kind of at the end of our preseason and moving into the first games of the real season.
Great. Gert, what about from you?
I think the CEO of Maersk came out and adjusted a little bit some of the expectations around a joint venture that they had around putting parts of the supply chain on the blockchain. And I think that's in a way representative of the state of the industry. It's probably one of the most widely piloted cases, using blockchain for track and trace and these kind of things. But I think, as to what you say, I think a lot of companies also realizing that it's not just about technology, but you've had many decades of trying to digitize what's going on in the supply chain, creating standards, creating networks. There are today literally thousands of networks and alliances, and for some reason this hasn't really taken off, and people are very kind of reluctant to adopt change and digitization in these kind of environments. So I think there's something about how can we incentivize people to actually start sharing data and start to digitize data. And the way I see blockchain in this space is as a kind of technology that actually allows you to distribute value among many participants and give back and help potentially create those kind of ecosystems that can actually propel a change in this space.
Hope, what about from you?
So I think to answer your question, it really depends what do you compare with. If you compare blockchain technology in supply chain to like SAP solutions or Tradeshift solutions, it's really like in baby stage. So there are like issues in both the application level and also the protocol level, but also on the blockchain level itself. Like on blockchain level, most of the public blockchains now have an issue for enterprise to process the transactions in a scalable and secured way. Lots of the private chain or consortium use cases, they have problem moving on to moving beyond the proof of concept stage, because it's hard to prove that it's actually more effective than using like traditional database when you just have like 7 or 10 nodes like controlled by a centralized party, and there are like protocol issues on regulatory compliance, industry standards, and on the application level there is issue, how do you incentivize people to use, how do you give enterprise accessibility so that they can deploy, manage, and monitor the network in a scalable way, how do you fit into their existing flow? Having said that, if you compare to where we were like 3 years ago, that's actually with the time I jumped into the rabbit hole of blockchain. So we started looking into like the Bitcoin blockchain at the beginning, where there was no like smart contract functionality to be used. We're like, oh, what can we do with this for enterprise use case? Not much. And then later on there's Ethereum, and we're trying to experiment, oh, what can a public blockchain do, or what can like Ethereum smart contract, what kind of use case can we create? And then there's like EEA forum, try to form like industry-wide standard, and later on there are more open sourced code built and shared so that we can actually build on top of that to give the privacy layer for enterprise. So I think 3 years ago, I thought it would take like 10 years for someone to launch a blockchain that can support enterprise. But now we're actually really happy. We're going to actually launch our blockchain in 2 months, but there are also lots of other enterprise-based blockchain that are like launching. So I think it really depends on where you compare with. So yeah.
So let's compare it to several thousand years ago. So trade is not something that's all new. Mesopotamia sort of developed without blockchain technology and invented a lot of cool things. What are the features? What is different that says, God, if I just had a blockchain, it would solve this crux of the problem for me in the supply chain?
I don't know, but in Mesopotamia, at least they had these very kind of persistent invoices that were actually scribbled in clay and stone, and that seems to be coming back in a big way today. No, so I think there's something simply about the ability to share something that came around with smart contracts. So the idea that you can have multiple parties agree on something that happens and actually write it in a shared place between you. And if you look at the enterprise world today in business to business, I think it's totally dominated by message passing. So everyone is sending this steady stream of messages to each other, mostly paper still today. I read a report, state of 2018 is 90% of all invoices in the world are exchanged non-electronically, still despite 45 years of effort. So there's something very powerful about this idea, and that I think resonates with many enterprises. If we could actually take the ledgers of our accounting systems and somehow put it into the middle, we don't want it to be compromised, and there's a lot of challenges. And then agree on whether it's audit, whether it's a settlement, if it's a financial transaction such as lending, insurance, yada, yada, yada. A lot of these things could be much, much easier in such an environment versus what we have today, where everything is really stored in silos. And so I think that's a fundamental opportunity here that really excites people. And now everyone is kind of finding their way around it and see how can we enter this very interesting space.
So when you say the most powerful for this message passing and invoicing, what exactly do you mean? Is it just more trust in that system and transparency, or are there other benefits as well that come with that?
No, I think they're really linked together, right? So what happens if you sell me something and I have to pay for it, is that we start exchanging some pieces of paper and we throw them away. Then we type into our SAP systems or other systems, what actually happened, and we are trying to reconcile our worldviews. Now, if you want to get value out of those kind of transactions after the fact, we'll have an army of people, whether they are credit bureaus or banks, going in and digging information out of the various workflow systems that we have, and that's incredibly expensive and inefficient. And so basically one of the key reasons why do small companies not have access to finance, access to market, and all these kind of things. Today, we can actually see the contours of some of the answers is due to information asymmetry.
Thank you.
I think it's not blockchain. It's decentralized, distributed architecture versus a centralized architecture. Now, blockchain is one implementation of a decentralized distributed ledger, but there are others out there. So if you ask what is the uniqueness about blockchain, it's that, and obviously, you know, when you have that, and obviously immutability and others, that what, you know, at the end of the day triggers or is the foundation for trust for the participant of that network. And I'm using the word network because I think it is a network. But I want to actually highlight to you an example of something that we're seeing in the market, in the pharma market, which is a real use case, which is called sellable returns. So if you're a manufacturer of a pharmaceutical and you have distributors, and you at some point as a distributor may have returns, so he needs to send them back to the manufacturer, similar to what you asked at the beginning today about the food. And so you need to be able to now track it to figure out, is it expired, is it not, am I supposed to, could I dispose of it or could I reuse it? So that all of that happens. There's two models now, and I'll talk about the European model and the US model. So this is not a new problem. It existed, and pharmaceutical companies are handling it today. The European model created an agency, a consortium, that actually deals with it and is a central repository for that. In the US, the government did not allocate or define how it needs to be solved or create an agency. So the US government, in the US, you had lots of companies figuring out who should own this. Do we trust, does one competitor trust another competitor in owning their information and all of that? So they were figuring out ways to get around it because it's regulations, but it was not an efficient way. With blockchain, that created now the ability to really, for SAP to work with about 15 pharmaceutical companies and create a basis for them to share information, but still own it in a secure way. And we did a pilot with about over 1 billion transactions. Wow. So I think that this is a good example of there isn't, from a technology perspective, there could be ways of solving it which are non-blockchain or not distributed or in a centralized. But it's not only about what is possible from a technology perspective, it's also what is possible from a business and what's the right solution from a market demand.
And on the pharmaceutical example, I mean, obviously a lot of pharma companies compete with each other. And
exactly.
You know, in this network kind of example, how do you sort of convince people to say, hey, join this network, which, by the way, is also going to help your competitors at the same time?
So from our perspective, it was easy in that sense because they had regulation. So the regulation really forced them to comply. And as we said, they wanted to comply, obviously, because it's the law. And their alternatives were more expensive. So the business case was very, straightforward. Now the question was, can you build a trust model between all these companies that would be sustainable? And that was really the difficult. So the difficulty was not the technology. It was actually the trust model between. And I would also highlight something that was mentioned here about smart contracts. Interestingly enough, we did several pilots. The first one was with smart contracts, which ended up not going well, not from a technology perspective, but actually from a cost and operation. And we ended up doing the second pilot with multi-chain, which doesn't have the smart contracts, which reduced the complexity, also enabled it to be more cost effective. So I would even highlight that smart contract is a component that needs to be considered when and how to deploy and when and how to use. And it's not necessarily, a mandatory component for an enterprise blockchain. But obviously, in many cases, it is needed, and it's critical to have that.
So obviously, there's some pilots going in. Hope, you're about to launch your ICO here in a couple of weeks, couple of months. What does the timeline look like over the next year or two for expanding into the industry?
Yeah, we're actually not doing any ICO.
Sorry.
We've done like a private round of raise, but we're going to launch our blockchain actually in the next 2 to 3 months, which we're very, very excited for because we have the privacy layer built for enterprise. We have guaranteed network security. We also have the usability where we can help the enterprise to just key in their AWS credential and then within a few hours, launch a few hundred globally distributed nodes across like 14 regions in a few data centers in the world. Yeah, so we're very excited about that. And I just want to add on one additional point about your question about if we, like back in 5,000 years ago, and then what is blockchain actually help? I think there is a proof of existence functionality of blockchain, which can really be useful in the supply chain field. Because, for example, if I have been trading you within the past 5 years, and you always send a quality insurance guy to check my goods, and now if I have a new customer, I cannot just bring our transaction record and the quality inspection report to the new customer to prove that I've been having good record, right? But in the blockchain, you actually can encrypt the data and put it as an immutable record so that I can prove that I have good record without actually showing the business information. So I think that is very powerful in blockchain as well. We actually already built that proof of concept, and we'll have a few more use cases coming up along with our mainnet launch as well.
And then obviously there's a lot of technical people in the audience as well. You're exploring a concept called quadratic voting as part of your governance. Could you give us a 30, 40 second
what you're
thinking about in that
This is actually something really, really cool because actually I know that Vitalik and Ethereum Foundation, they have started experimenting that earlier this year. We actually designed our model last year, and by the end of this month, we'll have a demo video, and next month it's actually going to go live along with our mainnet. So the idea is that we don't want our blockchain to be controlled by people who either have a lot of computation power or who are very wealthy that can buy a lot of tokens. So who do we decide the block proposal, right? How do we vote? How do we do the voting process? So we actually adopted the democratic voting theory, which is called quadratic voting. So the idea is that during each voting cycle, only a certain number of people can be voted in, and they're all KYC'd. And when everyone on our network registered and KYC to vote, they can only vote themselves in or vote themselves out. And if you win, and if you voted like 10 votes, then you have to pay like 10,000 token. Basically, we need, if you just need to pay a lot of token, and then at the end of each voting cycle, and the token that you actually paid will be equally distributed among every registered voters who participate in the voting during that round. So in that sense, yes, you won the vote. You get your node, you will be able to propose blocks, but you basically lost a lot of fortune, and also that fortune is distributed to the rest of the community who will, in the next round, have more voting power compared to the previous round. And also because everyone is KYC'd, so if anyone who is even willing to spend infinite amount of wealth trying to take over the network, it can be quickly discovered by it. Yeah, so
Awesome.
It's pretty cool.
Check that out online. So let's get back to supply chain. So I think one of the things I think is really interesting is just how many different complicated problems there are in this space. You have accounts receivable and invoicing. You have serialization and tracking around the world. How do you interoperate? I don't think any of your products sort of cover the entire stack, all horizontally, vertically, in every single category. So I mean, at some point, there's probably likely to be a multi-chain, a multi-product. How do you integrate, and how do you think about interoperation, Gert?
So I think it's so early days with many of these things. So standards are just emerging now. So even talking about interoperability can become perhaps a little bit abstract. But from the perspective of the customers that we are dealing with, I think most of them will have reason to participate in many different blockchain-based infrastructures. I think eventually they will be driven by the standardizations, the agreements, the semantics, the setups behind it, and it will be driven by industries, verticals that deal with food safety or medicine or tobacco or whatever the case might be. And also I think the physical blockchains or the lowest technological layer, they also tend to cater for very different use cases and scalability models and trade-offs between privacy and efficiency and so on and so forth. So I think it's actually more about creating access to the blockchains that we are focusing on. So that's basically creating a gateway to and from blockchains for all the volume that we are capturing in the network today. And I think that's key, but that's not like solved once and for all. That's an ongoing thing. Now we have this use case. Let's see which blockchain is it actually that it makes relevant. What is the business case that this particular blockchain can unlock, and then look at it from that perspective. But certainly identity is one of the key challenges here.
I personally think that the problem is not the access to the blockchain or that Uber blockchain, but it's actually, taking care of serialization that you mentioned and taking care of the quality of the data that goes into the blockchains. Because blockchain is immutable, so how do you ensure that data that goes in is accurate? And if we get that, and if we get serialization, which is not a simple thing to do, when you're thinking about crypto, everything is digital, but when we are talking about supply chain, you need to somehow identify the actual goods. Whether it's in the packaging, and think of a pills, and if you have liquid, how do you do it? And then there are even more advanced technologies that actually embed some things with watermarks or things into the materials themselves. So that whole space is critical to the blockchain, because the blockchain is at the end of the day a ledger. So if we don't have the foundations right and the data quality is not right, then we're putting immutable data forever in the blockchain. So I think that problem is not fully solved. And if we solve that in a good enough way for even one or two markets and industry, and we get that going, I think that will be a significant achievement. And then we can really start thinking about the next step, which is, okay, now how do we combine blockchains with the different data formats across multiple industries? So I think we need to look at it not top down, but actually bottoms up.
Mm-hmm. Hope you're launching your blockchain. How do you think about integrating with other products in the marketplace?
So because on day one, our goal is to build an enterprise-ready supply chain-based blockchain. So interoperability has been on our mind since day one. And that's the reason why we actually chose Quorum as our blockchain code base, because that's essentially a permission fork of Ethereum. Mm-hmm. So we still believe the future of public blockchain and the open source developer community, but we understand that at least in the short and medium term, there will be a lot of difficulties to adopt public blockchain. So we'll be perfectly happy if some of our clients want to fork our blockchain to do like private chain or consortium chain at the beginning before they move on the public blockchain. And because we built on top of the Ethereum fork, so in the future, any other Ethereum-based bridge created by the open source community, we can use that as a bridge between our blockchain and other blockchain base as well.
Let me ask one final question in the last minute here. I opened it up about a question of where does my food come from and how do I figure that out? How long are we away from that sort of world where we're going to know where everything comes from, how much it costs, that the finances were all covered on a distributed ledger? What's the timeline? Just a rough guess.
So on pharma, at least in certain places, it will happen in 3 years because of regulation.
Great.
Yeah, I agree that there's regulatory pressure. It will take some amount of time. I know also the industries are very, very good at pushing back on the regulation. So let's see how it unfolds. I think definitely in the financial space, so we know that anything about trade financing, insurance is a hugely liquid market, and it impacts 99% of all companies in the world. And I think that's key to unlock actually the supply chain transparency use cases. Because in the end, I think it's not so much about deploying a regulation or technology or what have you, but it's about taking part of the value that is created in a supply chain and sharing it amongst the participants. And I think that will help actually incentivize people to start sharing information. I think that is something that is needed to get it to work at scale.
Great. And Hope, real quick, what's the timeline?
I think 5 to 10 years, but
5 to 10.
I could really be wrong, since I was wrong about how long it would take for us to get here today. So I could be wrong. It could be faster.
Great. That's an inspiring message. Thank you, everyone. Supply chain coming up.